Okay, take two. Welcome to tonight's presentation, Wildlife for You presentation, a webinar on wildlife connectivity. This is a brand new webinar. We've never done this before. And so what we're doing is I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be your main presenter, Daryl Radijak. Most of you know who I am. Tell you more about myself in a second. But I'm also bringing in two really sharp gentlemen, Jeremy Romero from the National Wildlife Federation, as well as Jesse Dubell from the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. Both of those guys are just extremely intelligent and sharp when it comes to this topic of wildlife connectivity. So I'll have them turn on their mics. We'll talk to each other here in a little bit. But what I'm going to do most of the presentation. And then when it comes time to have a little chat about things that we can or should be doing on this topic, the three of us are going to have a nice conversation, and then we're going to be asking for questions from the audience. So sit back, relax, enjoy, and hopefully I won't have another hiccup like that last one. So, all right, on to today's webinar. So before we get started, usually we go through the wildlife experience of all of our instructors because the, the topics we're talking about are really important, and you have to have instructors and teachers that kind of know what they're doing. They have an education in it, they have experience in it. And so most of you know me. Name is Daryl Radijak. Got my degree in wildlife biology, 1992, way back when. That tells you how old I am. But I've worked in lots of amazing, amazing places. Started my career managing a place called the Appalachian Bear Center. I was the big game coordinator for the state of Tennessee. I was the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Most recently, I was the Wildlife Fish and Plants Program Manager for the Santa Fe National Forest. At that position, I actually won the Gifford Pinchot Conservation Education Award for the Forest Service. So not only do I know a little bit about wildlife, it's my passion. I love teaching about wildlife, and that's why we created this Wildlife for You, because I care so much about wildlife. We want to make sure that the public knows what they should or shouldn't be doing around wildlife. So that's a little bit about me. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask my instructors here to turn on their microphones. The first one I'm going to ask is Jeremy Romero, who is joining us. Jeremy, if you want to turn on your microphone and
Hey, thanks, Daryl. I hope everybody can hear me all right. I appreciate everybody jumping on the call. My name is Jeremy Romero. I am the Regional Connectivity Coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation. My focus for the past going on 4 years now has been working in southwestern New Mexico, in particular what we call the Upper Rio Grande, northern New Mexico, and south central Colorado. And my work's been focused on wildlife corridors and connectivity from multiple aspects that we'll talk about a little later. But I appreciate everyone jumping on the call, and I look forward to talking more about it.
all right, thanks, Jeremy. And then we also have joining us Jesse Dubell. Jesse, you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. My name is Jesse Dubell, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. And the New Mexico Wildlife Federation was founded in 1914 by Aldo Leopold. And one of my favorite places to recreate in the outdoors is in the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, which is part of the Gila National Forest System. So I feel extremely fortunate to be in this role and in this position and to have tremendous colleagues like Jeremy Romero, and we work closely together on all kinds of wildlife connectivity issues, on connected habitats, and just last year launched a very successful initiative called Connected Corridors. So I appreciate you having me on, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation and answering any questions folks have.
You will be happy to know, Jesse, that most of my students, especially if they're repeat students, I talk about Aldo Leopold all the time and always showing and giving him credit for helping to create the amazing world of wildlife that we enjoy here in North America today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. All right, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to give a little presentation about wildlife connectivity. And so it's going to be simple because some of you may not have really heard too much about this or may not know too much about it. So the very basic question I'm going to begin with is what is wildlife connectivity? If I ever hear that term, what is wildlife connectivity? And probably the most the simplest, most easy to understand answer for all of this, it's simply connected habitats. And the reason this is so important is there is a myriad of wildlife that just does not use one specific habitat or one location. They have to move literally from point A to point B. So if they spend a part of their life, whether or not it's cyclical in the spring or summer or fall, if they spend part of their time in one particular area, and then due to whatever needs, ecological or biological needs that they have, they then have to move to a different habitat. And the problem is getting from point A to point B is getting more and more complicated in today's world. And so that was my that was my son who walked by me. Anyway, it's getting more and more complicated in today's world, and it's really having an impact on some wildlife species. And so for the last 5 years, it has really become a hot topic in some high level government agencies, which is a great thing because we've known about this for some time. In fact, you'll see a little bit of history about this, but it really involves making sure that animals can move from point A to point B. And I'll describe that. So let's look at this overarching aerial view of a part of North America. And so I grabbed this off Google Earth, and there are some animals out there that actually travel a great distance. Now, I will tell you, for the most part, we are leaving birds off this discussion. The reason being, birds generally have no problem flying from point A to point B, and they travel tremendous distances, but they usually have no issue getting to places. Land animals and sometimes aquatic animals sometimes have more issues getting to these different locations. And so when we look at the large scale, this landscape level habitat, there are some animals that actually do travel not just tens of miles, but sometimes hundreds of miles over land to get to their favorite habitats. And so there are some obvious animals that might come to mind. So first and foremost, you have animals like pronghorn, usually out in the plains, sagebrush type of area. They sometimes travel great distances to get to different feeding grounds. And sometimes things could cause an issue for those animals getting from point A to point B. Obviously, another animal might be an elk. Now, typically, elk don't usually do these like long flatland migrations, but what happens a lot of times with elk is it's an elevational migration. They'll go from a top of the mountain to the bottom. Sometimes that's a great distance, but they do need to move some fairly large distances to get from their feeding grounds to their calving grounds to different parts of the habitat that they require. So obviously, if you have these large ungulates, these large herbivores that are moving all over the landscape, believe it or not, you actually have carnivores that may follow them. So these animals like cougars may follow their prey from point A to point B. But one of the classic examples, simply because there's getting to be more and more research that's following this, is looking at mule deer. This is not the only species that they're looking at. They're looking at a lot of different species, but there's been a couple of recent studies that just are remarkable to show the mass migrations that some of these larger animals do. And so take example A, where if you see where that letter A, that could be the wintertime feeding ground for a mule deer. Obviously, you get a lot of snow up in the mountains in the wintertime, and mule deer can't get around, so they go to lower elevations where they're going to spend a fair amount of the winter feeding and just surviving. And then at some point, they're going to want to go to a different part of the landscape in order to meet their nutritional needs. And oftentimes it's far away. And so that deer or other animal, whatever it may be, may travel, like I said, it could travel tens of miles, but oftentimes some of these animals will actually travel hundreds of miles to get from point A to point B. And we see a lot of these migrations, like I said, they go from lowlands in the wintertime to some of the mountainous areas in the summertime where they're going to be dropping their calves, just doing all sorts of other basic life cycle type of exercises. So that is literally what we're talking about with wildlife connectivity, traveling from point A to point B. The problem is we are finding more and more in today's world that there's getting to be some obstacles that are preventing animals from doing their natural migrations. And so some of these are pretty simple to see and to think about. So for example, urban sprawl. We have more and more people wanting to live out in the country. And so when these little subdivisions or towns pop up along these migration routes, these animals are cut off, sometimes cut off completely, but a lot of times they've got to walk around this new urban development. And unfortunately, it's a tremendous use of their resources. So they expend a lot of energy trying to walk around these things. But what else besides urban sprawl can block these migration paths? Things like energy development. Now, this is not a knock against gas, oil, any energy development, because as humans, we need these things. But some of these massive energy fields that create all these, what you see here, all these pads, can sometimes become a deterrent for these land animals that are traveling great distances. Now, I will tell you, I put a picture of this. This is either oil or gas development, but you could have wind turbines, even some of this green energy that we're trying to develop more and more of. If it's not done properly, it too can block some of these migration corridors. And obviously, if you develop some type of utility, you're going to have utility lines. Now you're thinking here, well, this isn't blocking any animal. I'll give you a prime example. If you have, and the thing that disrupts connectivity, if you have an animal that might be a forest type of animal, it could be some type of mouse or anything, they now have to cross these power lines, which opens them up to more predation. So some of these things can cause issues. One of the biggest things, and again, this is one of the most well-known obstacles when it comes to this mass migration of these land animals, are these major highways. Yeah, dirt road might not be an obstacle, 1 or 2 lane road might not be an obstacle, but as we develop more and more super highways, where they're 4 lane, 6 lane, however big they are, they sometimes become a major impediment for even some of these larger animals that you might think would have an easy time crossing them. They don't like crossing them. And so very simple to see how this can become an impediment. Here's something else you might think about, because this has literally been on our landscape for hundreds of years. There are barbed wire fences everywhere. You go out west and there's rarely a place that is not fenced in for some reason. Obviously, it was meant to keep cattle, sheep, or other livestock within someone's property. But these huge expanses that have barbed wire fences strung across them sometimes become an impediment even for some of the larger mammals. Something like an antelope doesn't really like to jump, and a simple barbed wire fence can sometimes block their movement. So what about, okay, everything I just explained to you is real easy to think about. If you're traveling 200 miles away and there's something big in your way, it's going to be quite a chore to get around it. Like, and we're talking city or energy development, it's going to be very difficult. But everything we've been talking about is on that grand scale, that really high level view of things. What about on a much smaller scale? Literally, what I'm talking about here is on a micro habitat scale almost. And so let's think if there ever could be an issue with wildlife connectivity or habitat connectivity with some smaller animals. So instead of talking about elk or pronghorn or mule deer, say we had some kind of like a swampy area, something that's indicative of the southeast, or anywhere where you're going to get a lot of these smaller critters, just tremendous diversity within these areas. Can things like turtles or even frogs or anything, some kinds of amphibians, could those be affected by habitat connectivity? Or even some mammals there. What about this is actually a mammal I'm quite familiar with. It's a New Mexico meadow jumping mouse. Can these smaller creatures be impacted by their habitats not being connected? Well, believe it or not, there's definitely some issues even with these smaller mammals that we now have to think about that we really never thought about before. And so, a prime example, obviously, even a single lane road or a 2 lane road sometimes becomes a huge impediment for turtles. Um, I my Facebook friends all the time, because they're wildlife lovers in the East, they're always moving turtles out of the road, or snakes. Whenever you are crossing something like that, it opens them up not just to predation, but getting run over by vehicles. It becomes a huge impediment because all this animal's trying to do is get from point A to point B, and they're losing their life. And so it's definitely becoming an issue even for smaller animals. But what about something like this? I don't know if I put it this way. If I'm going to ask a question here, if anyone can guess what's wrong here, um, why we have an issue, this. Oh, I'm just going to tell you. I'm not even going to quiz you. Um, this particular scene here is like a highly impacted stream somewhere in the west. And you see it's heavily incised. That stream, typically streams, natural flowing streams, are pretty broad. They have a big floodplain. Um, but what happens is if there's, for example, grazing that takes place and you remove all the vegetation that is around that stream, a lot of times, even when cattle have access to the stream, what it creates is this incised channel, and it causes the water to flow more quickly, and it starts cutting it deeper and deeper and deeper. And typically, streams should be fairly shallow, fairly widespread. Like I said, big floodplain. But what you see here is this stream that there's not much natural vegetation, riparian vegetation. When I say riparian, I'm talking about this kind of like wetland vegetation that typically grows around streams and rivers. And when that vegetation is removed, there are some animals that depend on that vegetation to get from point A to point B. They need it for cover. And so when you start thinking about this smaller scale, there are major wildlife connectivity issues even on the small scale. So there are mice that might not use this area anymore simply because the habitat is no longer in good condition. And so you begin to think or see why connectivity is becoming more and more in the mainstream of, hey, we got to make sure these animals not only have their habitat needs met, but they have the ability to travel within the habitats that they use. I'm going to throw a little picture up here. This is a menace here in the west. This is tamarisk, and so when you have another thing, and I won't spend too much time, but when you have non-native plants that then replace the native plants, that becomes sometimes a barrier. Like just like a city or a road could become a barrier. If there is a dense stand of non-native plants that certain wildlife species do not like to use, that too can become a barrier. So there's so many different nuances here that can become an issue if they're not treated or attended to. So, okay, everything I just mentioned dealt with land animals, terrestrial animals that move from point A to point B. What about fish? Is there ever an issue where fish can't travel where they want to? And believe it or not, it's actually a big issue. And I'm going to use the only fancy word for today. It's this word, anadromous fish, not andromous, anadromous fish. What those are fish that will live in the salt water. They breed up in freshwater, up in the streams and rivers of North America, but then they go to the ocean, spend a lot of time in the ocean, but then they come upstream. And so one of the things that we started doing as a nation early on, 100 years ago, is realizing the power of hydroelectricity. And we started damming all these rivers all over North America. And unbeknownst to us, well, I shouldn't say unbeknownst, but we really didn't care too much about it at the time because, heck, it's just a fish. But these dams create tremendous barriers. That is the only highway that these fish have to travel up to get to their native spawning grounds. And we just blocked it with this dam. Fortunately, we are doing better things nowadays to allow fish to continue swimming upstream. But I will tell you, this is going to be your little history lesson. The Columbia River, which feeds so many of the rivers in the Pacific Northwest and even the western region, when they started damming the Columbia River, there were communities that depended on some of those fisheries, the salmon, the Chinook, everything that was swimming upstream in the Columbia. And the fish at some point were so numerous that the indigenous people would go there literally with dip nets. And they would just scoop nets up out of the river. And that was what was sustaining a lot of these communities. And then lo and behold, way downstream, we decide to build dams. And over time, there's less and less fish that was available. And it really had a huge impact on these communities. Now, I'm not saying this was the only reason, but one of the things that was born out of an issue like this is that you may have heard mention of NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act. What that does is says whenever there's a federal action on whatever type of, whether or not it's federal property or a federal action, we have to do an analysis now to make sure we're not having major impacts elsewhere. And part of that analysis now looks at wildlife, which is a wonderful thing. It's overburdensome in so many cases, but it's a wonderful thing that we now have some oversight to make sure we're not having tremendous negative impacts on like fisheries or any other type of wildlife out there. So this whole idea of connectivity, habitats being connected from point A to point B, this is not a new issue. Animals have been needing to do this for eons. But it is becoming a bigger issue primarily because there's more and more humans and more human development, that wherever we are going nowadays, we could be upsetting the balance, those required connected habitats, and we're not even realizing it. So we are paying a lot more attention to what we're doing. Okay, I'm going to go over a couple of the solutions, and then I'm going to ask Jesse and Jeremy to start chiming in here. But some of the cool things, I will tell you, we have been thinking about this, and we have been putting out ideas that will help resolve some of these connectivity issues. For the most part, what it requires is just smarter planning. Because like I said, more human development, if we do things the right way, we're never going to have no impact on wildlife. But what we want to do is have as minimal impact as possible. So we have to start thinking about things in a much smarter way. And so first and foremost, if we are designing communities or developments in some relatively rural areas, you can do smart city planning and create greenways. These might be ways where coyotes or deer or anything else can still travel through instead of traveling around to save those energy resources. So doing smart planning, making sure you have green belts or greenways through the urban areas would definitely help wildlife. This is one of my favorite things, though. I told you roads were a major impediment. And I will give all the credit in the world to Canada. They were the leaders thinking about wildlife to begin with. The U.S. is coming out strong, we're very thankful for that. But this is a wildlife overpass. That's actually a photograph of the Canadian or transcontinental highway that cuts across Canada east to west. And this photo is in, I believe, Banff National Park. But they create these overpasses because what they're finding is it was cutting off some of these large terrestrial animals, whether or not it's grizzlies or mule deer or elk. They didn't want to cross that transcontinental highway. And so they constructed these overpasses where the animals can then cross freely. And so there's getting to be more and more of these. And like I said, Canada was kind of the leader. I actually saw that overpass up in Banff is so gosh darn impressive. But we're getting to the point where we're developing more and more of these overpasses to help wildlife cross over our road systems. And so just so you know, it doesn't always have to be an overpass. A growing solution is underpasses. And so instead of animals traveling over a bridge, they will go through a tunnel. And they're getting used. Once we create these underpasses, that these animals are figuring it out. Oftentimes we'll put fencing up to help direct them or steer them to the underpass or the overpass. But these large ungulates, mule deer, moose, antelope, bighorn sheep, they're using these underpasses. So obviously if you have those ungulates using those underpasses, you're going to have some of the predators, the natural predators, using those underpasses and literally following their prey wherever they go. And you even have some of these big critters, these grizzlies, that are even taken to these overpasses and underpasses. So they're being used. It's smart planning. It's a great example of us as humans doing things that are much better for wildlife than things we've done in the past. All right. Another thing, I told you that fencing can sometimes be an issue, especially for pronghorns that aren't prone to jump. And so this particular fence, you see the pronghorn or the antelope going underneath the fence. If you notice, the top 3 strands are barbed. The bottom strand is smooth. That way, if the antelope crawls underneath, there's no possibility of that animal getting entangled in any of the barbs or injured in any of the barbs. And so that's part of smart planning. Obviously, fencing, you can design it in so many different ways. You could have a smooth, you can put PVC pipe on the top wire, bottom wire. So whether or not an animal crawls underneath, jumps over the top, there's no possibility of that animal getting entangled in any of the barbs if they try crossing it. So it goes to show that we definitely have the know-how to create better solutions. And last but not least, I wanted to show you this. This is an improvement to help improve aquatic organism passage. So small fishes, salamanders, frogs, turtles. The thing that you need to notice here, oftentimes in the past, we would build culverts, those big tubes that allow water to go through underneath bridges. And we just stick the tube in there and create the road over top and call it a day. Nowadays, they're creating these more natural underpasses where literally the stream continues. It doesn't get interrupted by that tube or that corrugated steel pipe. They create more natural underpasses for these creeks that allow aquatic organisms to pass more freely. So my last slide, and then we're going to get into a discussion with Jeremy and Jesse. This slide here is really important because it's something that many of the federal and state agencies are doing. And prescribed burning forest fires were a natural process during the evolution in North America. And so we've eliminated fire from the landscape for 100 years, and now we're returning it because what we're doing, we're finding it improves habitat. And so sometimes one of the things that blocks animal movement, especially for those smaller critters, is when the habitat's not in good shape. It's too dense or...
Thanks, Daryl. I hope everyone can still hear me. Daryl, I think you brought up some really good points. The idea of connectivity is nothing new. Different agencies, different wildlife agencies, land management agencies across the country, across the continent, the world for that matter, have been doing a lot of research on how wildlife move and how habitats respond and the need to maintain connectivity. You know, and as you pointed out, there's many different ways to address this, whether that's through big game corridors, big game movement, whether that's through aquatic connectivity in the form of riparian connectivity. There's a lot of different ways that we can address connectivity. And in my work at the National Wildlife Federation as the regional connectivity coordinator, I tend to focus on big game. You know, big game tend to be a little bit more relatable to folks that don't have a little bit more understanding on kind of the complex nature of connectivity if we want to talk about endangered species or threatened species. And so I tend to really focus on big game species. A lot of the species that Daryl mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, elk, mule deer, pronghorn, predators, a lot of these species that can move vast distances from summer range to winter range and vice versa. And so here in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, what we call the Upper Rio Grande, we've had an opportunity to start to prioritize and promote wildlife corridors and connectivity, and we've been able to do that at multiple levels. One of the key things I think that's important for this conversation is folks can remember back to Daryl's original slide when he had a map of what was Wyoming, and is what we know as kind of the Red Desert area, the larger migration for mule deer from the greater Yellowstone to the Red Desert, and this has been one of our more well-documented migrations. But in that photo, what I think is important to notice is while those animals are moving from point A to point B, they're doing so at the extent of multiple land jurisdictions. So wildlife don't know any boundaries, right? That's a phrase we like to use regularly. And in doing so, when they're traveling from point B to point A, they can travel and cross into multiple jurisdictions. Let's keep in mind that the state manages the wildlife, right? While the federal agencies, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, manage the habitat. So at any given time in these wildlife migrations or movement patterns, they can be in various jurisdictions, right? And we're talking about state land, we're talking about federal land, we're talking about tribal land, private land. All of these are factors into how wildlife move and the ability for wildlife to either positively use this landscape or negatively use this landscape. And when we look at the West, and in particular the Upper Rio Grande in New Mexico and South Central Colorado, this is an area that's just absolute checkerboard of land ownership. And so in order to promote and prioritize wildlife corridors and connectivity, we have to have cross-jurisdictional collaboration and engagement. And so one of the big things that we've been focusing on at the National Wildlife Federation and in close work with Jesse and the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, just a fact, the New Mexico Wildlife Federation is an affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation. We have various affiliates across the country, and we work very close with our affiliates, as we'll hear today. A lot of the work I work with Jesse in promoting wildlife corridors and connectivity across the state of New Mexico, as well with the Colorado Wildlife Federation across the state boundary to the north. So, we've had an opportunity to understand that wildlife move in New Mexico and Colorado. Elk and mule deer travel from higher elevations in the summer to lower elevations in the winter. What we don't have, like places like Wyoming does, is the science, a lot of the data, a lot of the information that's showing on a map where wildlife move, but we know they do. And so there's been recent efforts to address this. We've seen federal efforts. Recently, the Department of Interior released a secretarial order called 3362, and it's improving wildlife migration and big game wintering habitat. And what this does is it directs state game agencies to work with the Bureau of Land Management to allocate resources to identify these data gaps, right? A lot of states want to do this work, but they don't necessarily have the resources or the expertise to gather this information. And so these resources and these programs allow for state game agencies to start to identify where these areas between point A and point B are, and how we can, as stakeholders, whether that's federal, state agencies, nonprofits like myself, how can we work together with private landowners, with tribes, to prioritize and promote connectivity. And the Upper Rio Grande is this perfect example, right? We've been able to, in the past 3 to 4 years, have a unique opportunity where we've focused on wildlife corridors and connectivity come from a multiple prong approach, right? There's no specific way that we feel or we've found to be a successful route in promoting or protecting wildlife corridors and connectivity. And so we take a multiple prong approach. And as Daryl was mentioning in the solutions, planning is a big part of it. One of the other key areas that we like to focus on that we can consider a solution is also policy. And then having the best available science and taking all of that and being able to reach out to communities, have strong community outreach, and in turn educate the communities on this information and how the dynamic of their lifestyles living with wildlife and the importance of maintaining these pathways or these corridors is a big part of it. And so they're not, I don't want to say any one of them is mutually exclusive from the other, nor is anyone more important. Policy drives planning, planning drives policy, best available science can support all of those. And that's what we've been really focusing on here in New Mexico. New Mexico was the first state to pass a piece of policy at the state level that's focused on just this. We passed what was called as the Wildlife Corridors Act, and this is the first of its kind, and what it does is it directs the Department of Transportation and the State Game Agency to come up with a comprehensive action plan that identifies wildlife vehicle collision hotspots, but also identifies the ecological importance of wildlife corridors. And so I've been very, I've been blessed with the opportunity to work on this development team, developing this action plan. And it's awesome because we've had an opportunity to really look at corridors from a wildlife vehicle collision perspective, which is an issue that happens all around the country. And to be quite frank, it's probably more prevalent in the eastern United States than we see in places like the western United States, where we have higher deer densities and more higher densities of humans, and therefore we have a higher rate of interaction. And so, with this piece of legislation, what it does is it identifies. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm getting some cross chatter there. But what this piece of legislation does is it provides the state with a framework to identify, prioritize, and promote wildlife corridors and connectivity. One thing to understand is the science is always changing. One of the best ways to identify where wildlife move is to call our animals. One of the most common practices is using telemetry data, GPS collars, or high-frequency radio collars, where folks can actually, radio collars that are placed on animals, and they actually beam a signal to a satellite in outer space. And then that satellite will beam the signal down to your computer, where in real time you can actually see where these wildlife are moving on the landscape. And that's happening on very different fronts, right? So tribal entities are doing this work. State game agencies are doing this work. One of the hard parts about this is making sure everybody comes together to work and understand who's doing what, where. So when we move forward with managing for corridors and connectivity, we're doing so by not reinventing the wheel, and we're doing so in a much more proactive manner. And that's kind of how policy can drive the protection of wildlife corridors. And as Daryl was mentioning with planning, that's vitally important. One of the unique opportunities we have here in the Upper Rio Grande is that a lot of our national forests were undergoing what's called the Forest Plan Revision process. And for those of you who don't know, this is a very important process. I have a tremendous amount of respect for our Forest Plan Revision teams. Basically what they are is it's a plan that drives the management direction of the forest for a long period of time. It can be anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And these plans have multiple uses incorporated into the management direction, right? We're talking about everything from hiking, camping, bird watching, timber, oil and gas, livestock grazing, wildlife. And so recognizing that we had two forests on the New Mexico side and a forest on the Colorado side that were adjacent to each other, where we know wildlife move in between, and all three of these forests were undergoing the Forest Plan Revision process, we had an opportunity to work and engage with this forest plan teams to emphasize connectivity. And Daryl can speak more to that. I think we've done a tremendous job and made significant progress in promoting connectivity through these plans. And I hope that when these plans are finalized, they can be somewhat of an example for other national forests that are looking to revise their land management plans as well. But that's just an example, right, of how planning can help promote and prioritize corridors at the federal level. We have things like zoning regulations at the local level, which can help non-development or non-usage areas where we know wildlife frequent, or where they or areas that are important to their ecological function. So, there's what I'm saying is that there's really no strong or really no successful clear path to promoting corridors and connectivity, and it really takes a collaborative effort of many individuals from many different agencies. And one of the strong things that we've been able to do, Jesse and I, is maintain this relationship and serve as a conduit amongst all these multiple stakeholders to keep the conversation going, to make sure folks are promoting and prioritizing and talking about wildlife corridors and connectivity, because it's an issue that hasn't been around, but as much fragmentation as we've seen in today's current habitat, the idea of promoting and protecting wildlife corridors and connectivity is definitely a hot topic. And there's some really, I think, I appreciate Daryl, putting me on this talk. And, I think one of the great things about my job is I'm by far not an expert when it comes to wildlife corridors and connectivity, but what's great is I get to work with those folks like Daryl, like folks from the state game agencies, and really surrounding yourself with folks like that who make this a passion and a lifestyle really allows me to further educate myself and become that much more passionate for wanting to protect wildlife corridors and connectivity. So that was kind of rambling on there a little bit about my work, but I'm going to pass it on to Jesse.
Well, before you jump on, Jesse, let me apologize to Jeremy. That was me jumping on. I was going to do an interlude there.
All right.
Because you mentioned. No, that's fine. You mentioned about the East Coast probably has a much greater need than the West, especially when it comes to some of these road issues. And part of my old man glasses, I'm getting old, but Katie Barber typed something in the chat box about some of the smaller scenic roads around Foothills Parkway and Blue Ridge Parkway. Those are over in the east near the Smoky Mountains. And whether or not those could become impediments. And one of the things, Katie and everyone else here, the national park, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, recently did a study on black bears and their home range. And there was a belief that there was lots of bears that lived inside Great Smoky Mountain National Park that spent their whole life inside the park. The park is 500,000 acres. And every bear that they collared, even in the deepest, darkest crevice of Great Smoky Mountain National Park, eventually made its way outside of the park and walked around in some of these more developed areas. And so roads in the east, it's not so much that they block movement, but the main issue with roads in the east is they kill animals. There's so many road-killed bears and deer and all sorts of other critters that get killed on these roads. And so when you have some really good habitat and you have one major road going through that habitat, this idea of developing an overpass or underpass to allow these animals to pass over that road without the threat of getting killed, that is a huge thing. And I think the East is really going to get more involved with that. The West, Canada led the way. And a shout out to the Albertan here that I think Jessica said she was from Alberta. Canada led the way. They were fantastic with that forward thinking. The western half of the United States is also starting to do a lot of this stuff. Kudos to them. And hopefully the eastern half of the United States, they're the redhead stepchild that just take forever to learn. But hopefully they will get there. Um, Before I get Jesse involved, and I'm going to get Jesse involved here in a second, I do want to address a couple of other questions. Um, Stephanie mentioned about she asked about the research about fish ladders. And for those that don't know, the dams that are put in on a lot of these major rivers, fish ladders are kind of like a detour that go around the dam and allows the fish to successfully swim up to the reservoir, the water behind the dam. And it was pretty amazing because some of these dams are getting pretty sophisticated with allowing fish passage. And I was up on the Columbia River in uh, the state of Washington. That was a couple of years ago, and I took a tour of one of these dams. And inside, they have some areas where they devote to ensuring that the number of salmon that are supposed to be getting upriver are still getting up there. They're still way below historic levels, but they would employ people that would count the fish. They would have plexiglass windows on some of these areas where the fish were swimming through so they can keep track of numbers. And so, like I said, we are getting better. Took us decades of realizing, boy, we weren't really smart in some of the things we've done. But now that we've recognized that we're starting to do things a whole lot better. Um, and Stephanie, I'm okay. I'm going to read Stephanie's second part, and then I'm going to introduce Jesse because she mentions caribou. Stephanie says, "Is there an appreciable difference between connectivity and habitat corridors? Maybe decreasing, only providing edge habitat or open corridors that many animals or large number of animals think caribou still avoid." I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there, Steph. But the fact that you mentioned caribou, one of the reasons why I wanted Jesse on board is so he can relate a recent experience. One of the easiest to understand massive land migrations that there is caribou. You may have heard of the porcupine caribou herd. Um, well, Jesse has recently returned from a long adventure up in Alaska. So, Jesse, I'd love
Sure,
to hear
Daryl.
your
Can you
thoughts
hear me
on
okay?
connectivity, how important it is, and if you could tell us a little.
Okay, just making sure. I had some technical difficulties on my computer, so now dialed in here on my cell phone. So glad you can hear me. I recently returned from the Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve in kind of northeastern Alaska, kind of central eastern Alaska, near the Canadian border, about 40 miles south of the Arctic Circle. And what I did there is I spent about 3 weeks following the 40-mile caribou herd migration. So I wasn't with the porcupine herd, I was with the 40-mile herd. But following their migration for just over 200 miles through super remote wilderness areas in Alaska. And the interesting thing about wildlife migration is that wildlife move across landscapes for different reasons. The reason that those caribou move is very different than, say, in the Gila National Forest, where elk will move seasonally primarily in search of water, where there are like dirt catchment tanks that accumulate water, and the elk and mule deer and various wildlife are drinking from those spots. And then in a drought like we have now, where we haven't had a significant rainfall in southwestern New Mexico since late July, many of those water sources have dried up, and so the animals have to move across the landscape to find water. Obviously, the caribou in Alaska that I was traveling with are moving across the landscape for a very different reason, and that reason is primarily food driven. They have breeding grounds where the herd goes to breed, and then they have wintering grounds, and all of the landscape in between those two areas is critical for the success of the species. Another thing important, I think, to mention about wildlife movement in New Mexico, and Jeremy might be able to talk more about this, but is the threat of drastic and severe wildfire. And it's not just New Mexico, obviously. We're seeing, horrific wildfires all across the western United States currently. And when those wildfires affect a large area, the wildlife having the ability to retreat to a safe harbor in a connected landscape is critical for the survival of those species. Can you hear me, Daryl? All right, sorry about that. I
Okay.
live in kind of a rural area, and so my internet connection here is not the greatest.
No, it wasn't bad. It kind of.
Yeah. So anyway, as I was saying, that the important thing about wildlife connectivity is still largely misunderstood. I mean, I don't think we fully understand how critical this issue is. We're learning more every day, and Jeremy did a great job of touching upon the science-driven management objectives. The New Mexico Wildlife Federation and the National Wildlife Federation and many wildlife agencies, including, in New Mexico, for example, the Department of Game and Fish, really work hard to adhere to the North American model of wildlife conservation and wildlife management. And the North American model really emphasizes the need for science-driven wildlife management. And as Jeremy talked a lot about, the cross-agency collaboration is critical. And we have the good fortune in New Mexico of having some terrific tribal partners. And the Santa Ana Pueblo has a Department of Natural Resources run by a gentleman by the name of Glenn Harper. And he had a radio collar. Actually, it was a GPS collar, a satellite collar on a mountain lion. I'm sure you probably followed the story, Daryl, but the mountain lion was named Broken Leg. And it was really inspiring to see the public develop a relationship with the movements of that particular animal. So Glenn would go on Facebook and social media and post where the mountain lion had been, what the mountain lion was eating, where it was going. And I observed the public becoming very interested and intrigued about that particular animal, and the awareness that created for the importance of habitat connectivity and connected corridors as it relates to wildlife movement was truly inspiring. So I'm really glad you put this together, because this is such an important topic. And as I mentioned, I think we just seen the tip of the iceberg as far as what we really are going to learn as it relates to this topic. The other thing I'll just introduce here, and we can talk about it, in more detail if you'd like, is the threat of disease. As we have more connected habitats and wildlife are moving across the landscape in a less obstructed way, we also run the risk of disease spread becoming more of an issue, more of a concern. So things like chronic wasting disease, for example, and that's one area of science that I think we really need to devote a lot of our attention to ensure that as we work towards more connected habitats and more unobstructed wildlife movement across the landscape, we do it in a way that ensures that we're maintaining healthy and robust populations of wildlife.
Thank you so much, and I'll call on both of you again here. The one thing I was going to add to your story about Broken Leg, unfortunately, Broken Leg ended up getting killed crossing a road, Highway 550. It wasn't even far from where I'm sitting right now, where unfortunately Broken Leg got struck by a vehicle. One of the most recent things, and Jesse, I don't even know if you saw it, but Glenn, he had a radio collar on one of Broken Leg's, believed to be one of Broken Leg's offspring, which has finally settled. It was born again on the Santa Ana Pueblo, and it made its way all the way to southern Colorado near Bayfield. And so you talk about walking tremendous distance. It's probably a few hundred miles. It's just wonderful for us to visualize, and I think that's where the science is really helping, because it's engaging people. People see these stories about individual animals, and when they're well put together, and I think Stephanie can agree, wildlife agencies sometimes are awful at engaging the public, but they're getting better. And so if we can engage the public more with these feel-good stories, it's going to end up with more and more involvement. And Jeremy, I'm going to have you answer Stephanie's question. She said, other than voting or commenting on proposed legislation, how can Joe Q Public help?
Stephanie, that's a great question, and I'll actually take a stab at both of your questions. But what can the public do to engage more in promoting and protecting wildlife corridors and connectivity? And there's a few things. Engaging obviously with your local elected officials and and emphasizing the support for such an issue is a big thing. One of the other things you can do is obviously reach out to your local state game agency. When it comes down to it, your local state game agency is the agency that's going to manage for wildlife. So they're going to be the most up to date on what the current processes and processes and current management strategies are for promoting and protecting wildlife corridors or connectivity, or for that matter, wildlife vehicle collisions. Places in the east where we have a high density of deer, we might not necessarily have significant wildlife corridors, right? But that's not to downplay the safety issue there behind it. So reaching out to these agency folks, but also reaching out to the local nonprofits, for example, as I was mentioning, we have state affiliates all around the country, and learning to see what organizations are taking this up and what organizations are having these conversations at the local and at the federal level are definitely places to start. I know when I started this job, I didn't really have an idea of where to start, and so it really started by calling folks like Daryl and bugging him a little bit and asking him what his thoughts and where his attitudes were on this issue and kind of what the forest was doing, and that just continued to percolate into reaching out to other folks and learning a little bit more about it. But my biggest advice is to reach out to the state game agency if you yourself have input, or if you firsthand have experience with wildlife corridors or seeing where wildlife get hit on the roadway. Your local transportation agency usually has a division that handles it, whether they document that or not. It's good to continue to emphasize the importance of wildlife crossings and wildlife corridors and connectivity. And those are just a few ways to be able to engage more at the local level. And then you also asked the question.
Wait, before you go on to that, Jeremy, another thing I'm going to add, and you touched on it, some of these nonprofits, some of these conservation organizations, whether or not it's Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation or maybe even some of these local birding clubs, whatever it is, sometimes there are projects such as removing old fencing, or if you really want to get your hands dirty, if you volunteer and work with a lot of these wildlife conservation organizations, they do on the ground work. I know in the east it's not that big of an issue, but in the west, sometimes there's projects where they're removing old barbed wire fencing or things like that. So the vast majority of projects are not related to wildlife connectivity, but any habitat project that is done, remember, improved habitat improves connectivity for those tiny creatures. And so get involved with your local wildlife organizations.
You said it perfect. And so Stephanie, you had brought up another question about the caribou and the corridors and connectivity, and I'll try to take a stab at that. I think I understand where you're coming from. One of the things in developing this action plan that prioritizes the wildlife vehicle collision hotspots and identifies them on the map is what we've learned is, you can't just put a wildlife crossing anywhere. You can't just put an overpass or an underpass on a roadway and expect the wildlife to use it accordingly. One of the important things to understand is that if Daryl can go to that Banff National Park wildlife crossing, there's a few key things to point out on that crossing, and one of them is Stephanie, as you were mentioning, it's for open spaces. This crossing is not just an open space, right? When we look at wildlife crossings, a lot of these areas have vegetation. The engineering that goes into constructing wildlife crossings is something that I've recently become very intrigued with. As you can see on that wildlife crossing, there's a lot of vegetation there that provides cover for animals that may not feel comfortable crossing a wide open space. Just for a fun fact, if you guys look in Wyoming, where some of our more documented and some of our wildlife crossings can be seen and visualized, in Trappers Point in Wyoming, where we know mule deer in Wyoming cross the highway, there's actually an overpass and an underpass almost adjacent to each other. And one may ask, why is there an overpass and an underpass? Well, different species will actually prefer the underpass over the overpass and vice versa. For example, pronghorn antelope will not utilize an underpass. They actually only used the overpass in Trapper's Point, whereas other ungulates like elk and mule deer will actually use the underpasses. And then let's take that a step farther, right? Let's look at an underpass where mule deer and elk will actually utilize. If it's not constructed in a manner that protects or makes wildlife not feel vulnerable, they won't use it. And it's something we call ledge effect. If folks have ever grown up, walked under a bridge, you'll notice that sometimes the way they're constructed are pillars, and there's actually a ledge underneath that underpass. And what that does in a natural environment to an animal, say walking down a canyon, what it does is it makes them feel vulnerable because they feel that there's a predator sitting above them on that ledge, and they have the upper advantage. And that's something wildlife, especially mule deer and elk, when they're trying to utilize a crossing, they don't like, and they'll actually deter and not utilize that area. So when constructing these areas, we really have to understand the biology of what animals are going to be utilizing these crossings, recognizing that if mule deer are the primary species that are going to be utilizing this crossing, how do we make it safe to where mule deer are not vulnerable? Also, how do we make it in a manner that benefits all other species, as Daryl was mentioning, right? We want the biggest bang for our buck, and we want to be able to utilize, these retrofitting projects, these construction projects. They cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to construct. So when you do these, you want to make sure you have the biggest bang for your buck. And understanding vegetation needs, understanding things like ledge effect, understanding how to engineer these crossings to better corridors to allow for wildlife to feel more safe and less vulnerable is something that is really overlooked, and something that, at least here in New Mexico, we've been working with other states that have been leading in this work to understand how we can retrofit our potential areas to reduce wildlife vehicle collision hotspots, and how things like vegetation and the engineering into these actual crossings play into successfully managing for corridors and connectivity.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to try to address some of these other questions. And Jesse, if there's any question you want to answer, feel free to jump in. I'm looking at Trisha's question about is there concern that corridor connectivity may move unwanted species, either plant or animal? That's a really good question. Both your questions are excellent, Trish, because sometimes when you don't want the spread of invasive species, and man, there's a couple of really cool, interesting examples, because believe it or not, sometimes even in the wildlife, or especially the fisheries world, we create barriers to prevent the spread of certain species. Prime example are fish barriers. When you have non-native fish species that could outcompete native fish species, sometimes we erect barriers to prevent that non-native fish from moving. So there are definitely issues we got to work out there. And your second question about if predators becoming accustomed to prey traveling through there, and what you're describing is called a predator trap. It's where predators know where to go and find food. And I talk about all this all the time, because one of my biggest pet peeves is people in the East think that we humans need to feed wildlife in order for them to survive. And so many people will put up deer feeders or other kind of feeders thinking that the wildlife need them. And unfortunately, it creates these predator traps, because over time, the predators realize if I just sit here in this area, a deer is going to come by and I got easy pickings. That is a really good question, Steph. And this is where we need research and science helping us to make better decisions. So we are constantly learning. The one thing that some people believe is science is absolute, and it's not. Science is a progression. We learn things, we learn to do things better, And so I'm anxious to see where we go in this direction and what the science says. We need science to help lead the
Daryl,
way.
if I
So
if I
those
may
are
add,
absolutely fantastic
if I may add
questions,
a thing
Trent.
or two, one of I
So
think
I
that
hope
question brings
those
up
weren't the ones you
a
wanted.
really important point. One of the really kind of misconceptions when it comes to wildlife corridors, and it's something I get a lot, is a lot of people at times think wildlife corridors are something that's man-made or constructed, right? So when I was having these conversations about wildlife corridors and how we promote and prioritize and protect them, folks were asking me questions like, what are these corridors going to be constructed out of, right? And once these corridors are identified, um, am I going to be able to see it from my front door? And the answer is no. These corridors are naturally existing on the landscape, and all we are doing as managers and as collaborators are working to identify where they are moving on the landscape within this natural environment. And things like crossings are how we enhance these wildlife corridors. And it's a pretty simple concept, but you'd be surprised on how many times people just would think that the two are connected when actually the intent is to not fragment habitat, right? We're talking about how fragmenting habitat can have a negative impact on a corridor. And so the idea would not to be that. It would be to, identify the natural pathway that animals are currently or should be using on the landscape, and how do we enhance that? And things like crossings can be just that, and they can happen in urban areas. A great example is if folks are familiar with Los Angeles and the cougar crossings there and the wildlife crossings that they're hoping to create over I-10, I believe. This is going to be the largest wildlife crossing in the United States, and it'll help a plethora of species, and it's in the heart of one of the largest metropolitan areas. So, wildlife corridors, they can be anywhere. They can be very small. They can be very wide. We can see crossings that are miles in length where wildlife utilize a crossing and a corridor. Or we can see a bottleneck, right, where wildlife, for example, only cross a certain spot that may be a quarter mile, an eighth of a mile wide, even less, due to various reasons, whether that's landscape features, whether that's fragmentation. It can be for various reasons. And so I think that's one thing that a lot of folks tend to misrepresent when it comes to wildlife corridors, and I wanted to make sure folks understood that kind of concept.
Hey Jesse, you want to jump in? Do you think you can answer Joni's question about animals following the same path, or you just take it where?
Yeah, well, I think that's very species specific, Daryl. The caribou are very fascinating in the way that they migrate, and they do follow essentially the exact same path year after year, and that is really an interesting challenge when you start talking about the reintroduction of species, for example. So in 1996, the 40-mile caribou herd that I recently spent some time with was estimated to be about 2,500 animals, which was very, very low. I mean, those are dangerously low population levels. And Alaska Fish and Game was very concerned because if that particular herd had essentially gone extinct or been exterminated, it's very difficult to reintroduce caribou to that area because they don't have the instinctive migration routes. They haven't been imprinted from their mothers. Essentially, the young caribou follow the footsteps of their mothers and their family groups and their herds and their units across the landscape, and then they have the natural ability to replicate the exact path year after year after year. So if that herd had disappeared, it's not like you could just take caribou from another area, put them down there, and expect them to thrive. So the Alaska Fish and Game worked very hard to protect that herd and to rebuild the population. And when I was there in August, Alaska Fish and Game estimated the herd population to be nearly 80,000 animals, which they actually believed was above the carrying capacity of
that particular habitat, the carrying capacity of the area. So they're working to reduce the herd. So in the case of caribou, they do travel in large groups and they do follow the exact same pathways year after year after year. As we talk about migrations and movements, so not all migrations are seasonal. And when we talk about seasonal migrations, I think a lot of times we attribute the seasonal migration to the weather. But that's not always the case. It's not always weather that's driving this animal movement across the landscape. Bighorn sheep, for example, a male bighorn sheep will travel great distances in an effort to find a mate. So the breeding instinct causes that sheep to move across the landscape, and he will not be following the same migration patterns generally that you would see with caribou, following an identical path. The sheep is going to wander, utilizing his senses, primarily a sense of smell and sight, to try to find a mate. And he's wandering the landscape, in some cases almost sporadically. It almost seems like a random movement across the land. And so that particular movement is going to be a single animal for the most part. It's not going to be moving around as a large group. When you look at the elk herds in, say, Jackson Hole, that's typically a big herd movement. You're seeing a lot of animals moving across the landscape, and they're following not necessarily the exact same trails like you would see with caribou, but generally the same corridors, the same areas, the same drainages, for example, or the same mountain slopes. So hopefully that answers the question.
You bring up a really good point. One of the other factors that can influence wildlife using the same pathway each year is obviously habitat fragmentation, and we've touched on it multiple times. Things like catastrophic wildfires, Jesse mentioned earlier. What happens when a migration route is traveling through an area that has just been affected or is being currently affected by a catastrophic wildfire? There's a lot of research and a lot of science being currently conducted that's trying to understand this. How are animals and how are these species going to react to these areas after they've had a negative influence that has veered them a different direction, a pathway that may be less favorable, not have as much cover, not have as much feed. When these areas that have been affected by wildfire are now regenerate, will these species that historically used these areas, will they tend to go back? Will they continue to use the area that they were displaced to? These are all questions that are currently trying to be answered. And in some areas we have examples, in some areas we don't. And each place is different, but it's an important thing to consider when thinking about wildlife movement, is these corridors can be impacted tomorrow. We can have, things like climate change, things like development. And so, I think Jesse nailed it perfectly. I think these wildlife tend to historically use their corridors. They learn from their mothers. But they all don't use it the same way. These species all utilize them in different manners, and they can obviously have drastic impacts when it comes to things like climate change or habitat fragmentation due to wildlife unfriendly fences or roads or other forms of habitat fragmentation.
Great point, Jeremy. I was going to just kind of add to one thing to that and just remind everybody that wildlife tends to be very, very adaptable. A lot of people think, for example, of elk as an animal that inhabits, steep mountain slopes and heavily wooded areas, and that's true, but that's not true historically. If you look back before human development impacted habitat in such a tremendous way, elk were essentially a plains animal. You would be more likely to see elk out in the Great Plains than you would in the Rocky Mountain West. And so the species has adapted to adjust to the human impacts. So species are very adaptable, but I think it's one of our responsibilities as stewards of this natural resource to make every effort to minimize their need to adapt, to try to allow them to live in the environment that they're naturally evolved to live in.
Thanks for adding that, Jesse. I was going to give a shout out to Jeremy for what he said about these corridors being dynamic, because that was one of the things when we were developing some of the forest plans. There's a lot of people that were really pushing some of the agencies to map out these corridors to protect them. And I understand that that is definitely what we need to do. But one of the hesitations we had was drawing lines on a map and say, this is where the animals move, and then being locked into specific regulations for that particular area. The reason being, just like Jeremy mentioned, things like a major wildfire, climate change, that could result in animals using different paths or different corridors. And so if you are locked into only one specific area, over time that could become just completely useless for protecting those animals. And so one of the things we want to do moving forward is making sure we are dynamic, we're malleable, we're able to use the leading science to figure out where the animals are, where they're going, and make sure we always protect them along every step of the way.
I think it's important to also, understanding that by being flexible and being adaptive, there are existing places where there can be those efforts to prioritize, if we want to call it, place-based protections for wildlife, where we know for hundreds of years they've used these areas and they do require protection, recognizing that with tomorrow they could possibly change. And so having those flexible options and having those management strategies to work in that dynamic is important. And we see those kind of in these forest plans in kind of two components, right? We see place-based protections where we know wildlife move, but then we also see or have what we call forest-wide management prescriptions, which also are just as important, if not more important, in my opinion, in making sure that the whole entire forest, the whole entire habitat is emphasized for wildlife and their habitat. And so it's I think having the fine balance of both and being able to, as you said, be adaptive, be flexible and dynamic. And that's the only way that I think we as stakeholders can continue to have these conversations and continue to be proactive and successful in educating folks and being able to promote and protect connectivity in wildlife corridors.
All right, I think what we're going to do, Jeremy and Jesse, thank you so much for chiming in, joining us, telling us about some of the things you're doing. We are going on almost an hour and a half, so I'm going to wrap this up. Just so you know, that is a photo I stole from Jesse's Facebook page when he was on his recent Alaska trip. Absolutely gorgeous photo. You can see the caribou that he was fortunate enough to harvest and put in his freezer. But to wrap it up here, I do want to tell everyone, this is a big thing. I hope Jesse marks this down as well. Many of you know about my student program that we take the students from underserved communities. 2 weeks from today, I'm doing a special fundraiser. It's another Black Bear Campfire Talk, but it's simply going to be talking with a couple of specialists. We're going to keep it small. I'll be obviously there to moderate, but I'm bringing in Janet Dalton from the Appalachian Bear Rescue. She has worked with all these wild bear cubs for the last 10 years or so. Tons of stories of rehabbing some of these orphan cubs and returning them to the wild. But I also wanted to bring in Kim Titchener, who is a grizzly bear. She's not a grizzly bear specialist. She has dealt with a lot of grizzlies, but she teaches a lot of the bear safety training to government employees, especially up in Canada, and also private enterprises. And so we're going to have those two people join us. If I could get one or two more to join in, I'll let you know. But in order to participate in this, it's a donation to our student program, to that SWAP program. So a minimum $10 donation. If you can't afford that, just reach out to me. I'll get you in there. But it's to raise money for the students so we can take them to Yellowstone next year. And so I already told you about our podcast. Stephanie, I think, already hopped off. But Stephanie is another Wildlife for You instructor. We've been doing a podcast for the last 3 weeks. It's actually growing in popularity. We're very pleased with that. But something to listen to learn more about wildlife as you drive to work or go about your cleaning chores. Completely free. We do these because we just like educating the public. And then, obviously, last but not least, we do have a website that you can visit. My dog really wants to go outside right now. We have a website you could visit, wildlifeforyou.com, where you can learn all about our upcoming classes. But the best way, follow us on Facebook or Twitter. That's where we announce all our classes, any new information coming up. By all means, join us there. So with that, give credit where credit is due. Lots of photos from my friend Bob Houdeshell. But thank you so very, very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jeremy and Jesse, if you have any last words. I can't thank you enough.
Thanks, Daryl, and I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their evening to join us. This is a topic I think we're all passionate about and we love talking about. So we're happy to take the time to share it with you. One thing I did want to share with folks before I leave is I did leave a couple links to some resources in the chat box. One of them is connectedcorridors.com that talks a little bit more about the work we're doing, in particular in the Upper Rio Grande. And then the other is KAVU. This is an organization we work with to kind of put the work we're doing into a short video series. So I hope folks like that. And if they have any questions, feel free to reach out to Daryl, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Thanks, Jeremy. And
thank you for sharing those links, Jeremy. The last thing I'd like to mention, Daryl, earlier it was asked, how people can help and how people can get involved. And although not directly relating to corridors or connectivity, I would like to remind everybody that we do have a bill in Congress right now called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that bill would provide all of the states with significant financial resources to do all kinds of wildlife habitat projects and recovery efforts and things like that. So if anybody feels so inclined, I think it would be great if they could reach out to their federal electeds and just encourage them to please support the Recovering America's Wildlife Act.
Awesome, Jesse. I'm glad you mentioned that. So thanks again to everyone. I will send out a copy of the recording so you can watch it as much as you want and share it with your friends. So other than that, I'm going to bid you a good night, and we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks for that bear talk with all the to raise money for our SWAT program. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it, and I'll catch everyone later.